welcome everybody who is here and also who is watching it remotely after the event to the TTA Spotlight Series, the compliance webinar. So quite straightforward today. We're going to go through the different key areas of rules and regulations that affect tuition companies. We'll go through what areas of regulation there are. We'll go through what those regulations say and what you can and what you can't do. And then we'll go through some common pitfalls, and obviously people that are here can ask questions. If you're not here and you're watching this after the event, then obviously you can send questions through to info at the tutorsassociation.org.uk, and then we'll be able to make sure you get those questions answered properly by our internal team. So let's kick off. So first of all, the regulations that there are. There are a number of areas of regulation which all businesses have to follow, including tuition companies. I'm going to rattle through some of those fairly straightforward. So obviously in terms of tax, which is managed by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs now, HMRC, you have to pay corporation tax on profits every year. You have to pay PAYE on employees and collect that at source, i.e. before you pay them and you deduct the tax and you pay it to HMRC. You have to pay VAT if you are above the VATable threshold, and that only counts for your VATable turnover, and we're going to come on to that a lot more in a minute. So VAT is a tax which applies on sales, so it's VAT applies to the sales value, not profit. It applies to you when turnover exceeds £85,000 a year. So when the total VATable revenue for your business goes above £85,000 a year, it is mandatory to register for VAT, and then to collect VAT, but you can also claim back on input VAT. So if you buy stuff from somewhere and you pay VAT, then obviously you can claim that input VAT back. So there are a few key areas of tax: PAYE, corporation tax, and VAT. HMRC also has a couple of requirements for people that are not specifically a tax per se, but are designed to help them address tax evasion and tax avoidance schemes. So the main one that tuition companies need to be aware of is employment intermediary reporting. So employment intermediary reporting is quarterly. It applies when you have workers that are paid off payroll. And off payroll means you're not paying them as an employee and deducting tax at source, so you're not paying them through PAYE. And if you have off payroll workers, and that can be self-employed contractors, and if they work from an address that's controlled or managed by the client, either they go to a client's house or they go to a school where you're delivering a tuition program, then you need to account for them with employment intermediary reporting. So you need to register on HMRC's website. TTA can give you the details about how to do this as well. You register for employment intermediary reporting on HMRC's website, and we'll talk about it in a bit more detail as to what you've got to put in. There are a couple of issues we have had with employment intermediary reporting where people haven't had things like unique tax references for some of their tutors, and that's one of the things you need to fill in on the form or on the spreadsheet that you have to upload. Where that's the case, TTA is recommending to corporates for the time being, until we can establish what the solution is to those kinds of issues with HMRC, do whatever you have been doing. When we can find out any update on how we resolve those particular problems, obviously we'll come back to you, and depending on your situation, you'll then have to adopt whatever HMRC says is the compliant approach. But we will help to find that out for you, and it will help to deal with those situations. So from a tax perspective, just a quick run through. We have corporation tax paid on profits every year. We have PAYE, which is for any of your employees, including if you pay yourself as an employee. We have VAT, which is mandatory to register for VAT if you're above the £85,000 turnover threshold and applies to sales. And we also have not strictly a tax per se, but we also have employment intermediary reporting if you are paying workers off payroll who are working at the client's premises or premises managed by the client. So client's house or a school. So they're the main areas of tax. Now, most of those are sometimes employment intermediary reporting is an issue for people, and we will talk about it a bit more in a minute. The other big area of compliance that's caught a lot of people out in recent years is the Employment Agencies Standards legislation. So there's the Employment Agencies Act 1973, which stipulated some rules around how employment agencies should work. Now, before we go into this in any more detail, we need to clarify exactly what is an employment agency and what is an employment business. There was a judicial review, which a couple of tuition companies actually led, to try and challenge to see if there was a third way in law, and it lost. So the judge effectively said there isn't a third way. You must either be an employment business or an employment agency if you're a company at all. So there is no third option. You are one or you're the other. An employment business is like most businesses in the country. They hire staff, they take on contractors, they do whatever they want to do in terms of taking on people who deliver work. They then have a separate contract to provide services or goods to clients, customers, whether they're consumers, whether they're schools, whether they're businesses, doesn't matter. And they are the intermediary. So the employment business is contracted, legally obliged to deliver a service or a good, and is then going to pay people to help it to do that. Okay, it means if the service is not delivered, the employment business is liable. Okay, because the client will say, well, you said you delivered tuition on this day at this time, no one turned up, that's your fault as the company, right? But the company will then subcontract or will employ people to deliver the work it's committed to, right? Almost every business in the UK works like this. Tesco works like this. Sainsbury's works like this. Lots and lots and lots of companies work like this, where they employ people, they produce something, they provide some kind of service, and they sell that kind of service on from the company itself. Okay, it's very normal. Lots of tuition companies also do this, but the key important thing to understand is that if you are selling something to somebody who is a consumer and you're above the £85,000 threshold where VAT registration is mandatory, you must charge VAT on the full value of any goods and services you provide, subject to those goods and services being VATable. I'm afraid tuition at this point in time is VATable when it's provided by a limited company. Okay, so a limited company that's operating as an employment business has to charge VAT, subject to it being over the threshold, of course, and then having to register, has to charge VAT on the full amount of the tuition that is being sold. So if you sell tuition at, let's make up a random number, £60 an hour, and even if £35 goes straight to the tutor, okay, £25 is going to you. You're charging VAT on £60, so it's £12 VAT on top, yeah, which you never see, obviously. You see it, and then it goes back out to HMRC. That's an employment business. It's quite a straightforward model, right? The business itself is legally contracted to provide the tuition and then sources somebody to provide it. Right? The other option is being an employment agency. This is different because the employment agency itself has a contract with the client only to introduce a worker to provide the services. Now, the employment agency may on its own do something else and provide services separately as an employment business in some other respect. So I know you can sell books as well, and that's a separate thing, right? It could be a separate transaction, or it could be lumped to the same transaction. It's up to you. But the employment agency, when it's providing tuition as an agency, what it's doing is it's saying to the client, I'm introducing you to this tutor or to a tutor who was appropriately checked and qualified to teach whatever you've wanted. But they will deliver it themselves, and they will have a legal relationship with you themselves. So here we have a triangle. Yeah? At the top, we have the client, right? The client is saying, I want tuition in, let's say, most common subject in the UK is maths. So they say they want someone to teach them maths. Fine. Down here, we have the employment agency itself, okay? Now, the employment agency is not legally obliged to actually deliver any maths tuition, right? But they have said that they will do their best to find for the client a tutor. And typically, this is a, no, if you don't introduce it to anyone, you don't pay anything, right? There can be still cases where there is some sort of registration fee if you really want it, but it's not normal practice. And then down here, okay, we have the tutor themselves, who doesn't have a contract with the employment agency per se, but there is an agreement that the employment agency will basically try and find work for them. And if they introduce them to the client, the employment agency will charge the client. Yeah. So then the tutor would work directly for the client, legally speaking. And if the tutor doesn't turn up on the given day and the given time, it's the tutor who is at fault and who the client would have to pursue rather than the company. The company technically says, well, we introduced you to them, okay? it's the tutors. If the tutor didn't turn up, please call them. Okay. Now, importantly, you need to be aware that what most employment agencies do in the country is they charge some kind of fixed fee or some kind of percentage of annual salary as the fee for finding your particular person, right? So if most recruiters would do it like this, they say, you want a tutor, let's say, well, I'll find you a tutor, and when I find you a tutor, you pay me 15% of their annual salary. Okay, whatever it is. And so I'll find the annual salary, you pay me that, and it will go away. Now, most tuition companies do not operate like that, for obvious reasons, in that most parents do not want to pay a huge whacking fee straight off to be introduced to a tutor. So what most tuition companies do, who want to operate as employment agencies, which is entirely legal, is they say, well, look, your fee is calculated as a percentage or as a certain fixed amount per hour of tuition delivered. Yeah. So you want tuition every Monday at 5 o'clock, that's fine. But for every hour of tuition you have from Tutor Bob, you're going to pay us at the agency £20. Okay, that's totally fine. And then what happens is that contract with the client, between the agency and the client, is enforceable. The agency then bills the client for £20 every month. The tutor then bills the client for whatever their fee is, let's say £30 every month. The client pays the £50 and everyone goes forward. Now, why do you want to have that complex relationship, and what does it mean for you if you do have that complex relationship? So as an employment agency, you cannot charge the tutor anything, right? You can't start saying to the tutor, you must buy this with us, you must pay for this training, you must pay for that, right? You can offer things that are completely optional and charged for. So you can offer them some training and say the training costs 100 quid. But you can't force them to go. You certainly can't force them to pay for it. Yeah. You can still require that they're appropriately trained or qualified to do whatever teaching they need to do, but you must not be forcing the tutor to pay for anything. And that's a general principle with regard to self-employment in general. Even if you're an employment business, you cannot force self-employed tutors to purchase things from you. Yeah, that's a very serious problem if you stop doing that. However, if you're an employment agency, the reason why you might want to do this is because you're not going to have to pay VAT on the fee that is due to the tutor, because you're never going to receive it. And why are you never going to receive it? Because the Employment Agencies Act 1973 made it very, very clear that the employment agency is not allowed to make arrangement for the payment of the work seeker's fee. Now, the work seeker in this case is going to be a tutor. The employment agency is a tuition company, and the tuition company is not allowed to make arrangements for the payment of their fee. And what this means in practice is that you cannot take the money, all of the money from the client, and then pay the tutor as an agency. As an employment business, you can, because you can contract with the tutor yourself and you're providing it to your client as a company, providing that tuition. But as an employment agency, you're providing the introduction. You cannot take the tutor's fee and pay it to the tutor. Okay, that is absolutely against the regulations, and you can't be in control of that process either. Yeah, and so you can't start a second company, which is basically, I know, Tutor Payments Limited, and also control that company and take the payment into that company instead. That's not allowed. Yeah, what you can do is you can both choose. So tutor and agency can both choose to engage with a third-party provider who will send the invoice for you, right? Now, there are some tech companies that do this. You can use Stripe Connect. Tutor Cruncher built a solution for this. A couple of other people have built solutions for this as well, or could be building them in right now. So there are different ways you can go out and source this kind of service. But if the tutor and the tuition company both agree, and they must both agree, you can't force tutors to do this, then the tutor could say, yeah, I want to use this service, the payment service to collect my money, right? And the tuition company can say, well, I want to use it to collect my money as well. So they both send their invoice or log their hours with this service, like Stripe Connect or whatever it is. And that service then sends a combined both invoices and a total amount to pay to the client. Now, this is what we can call split billing, yeah? Because the client's been billed twice, but then when that bill is paid, it's going to be split, and it's going to be paid to each respective party. So remember, in this case, the employment agency is never going to be touching the tutor's money. It never belongs, and it never is controlled by the employment agency, which is how that is compliant with the rules. Just must be followed to the letter, right? You must not at any point make arrangement for that and try and control that process. You cannot force the tutor to do this. Yeah? The tutor has to agree completely of their own free will. And if the tutor doesn't want to do it, you can't try and punish them in some sense. Yeah, that would be against the rules. Okay, so work seekers are not allowed to be paid by the employment agency itself. Okay, if the employment agency is genuinely acting as an agency and not as an employment business. Okay, and that's really, really important. So what's the benefits and the pros and the cons of this? The benefits and the disadvantages. Well, the benefit is you're going to pay less VAT because you're not paying any VAT or charging any VAT on the portion of fees which is due to the tutor, because you're never going to receive that into your account. Yeah. So if we use the example where tuition costs £60 in total, 25 is going to the agency and 35 is going to the tutor. Okay. The £25 is what you receive as turnover, not 60, 25. So obviously you'll reach the VAT threshold later because you need to do more hours of tuition at £25 commission to get to £85,000. Okay. But as well as that, when you get to that VAT threshold and you do have to register for VAT, then you're only paying VAT. You're only charging and paying VAT on £25, okay, which is £5, not 12. Yeah. So the client would see their cost of £65, including VAT, and the £35 that gets paid to the tutor, because of tutors are generally not eligible, not required to pay VAT if they're delivering the services themselves as a sole trader. That won't have any VAT on it. Okay. So the employment agency route allows tuition to be more affordable. Now, typically, the sorts of companies that would want to go down the employment agency route are those companies where their tutors are more expensive, and therefore the VAT, adding the VAT onto that portion of the tutor's fee is going to make a big difference to the price point. Yeah. If you've got very experienced tutors, I don't know, let's say you're teaching A-level calculus or something, and the tutor wants £70 an hour, right? They're quite expensive. Then obviously that £70 on its own, which wouldn't normally incur any VAT, if that started having VAT, it's obviously going to be a problem for your clients, right? Add that on top of your fee and the VAT on top of your fee. Yeah. So if you're a budget tuition company where you're offering a much more economical tuition at a much lower price point, like 25 or 30 pounds, it might be that you're only paying 20 pounds or 15 pounds to the tutor, and actually adding VAT on 15 pounds doesn't make a big deal. Yeah, that's £3, which is not enormous in the grand scheme of things. Yeah. Whereas adding £14 on top of your fee might actually be quite a lot if your tutors cost £70 an hour. So we can see then that employment agency is a route which reduces the VAT implications of delivering tuition, but also means you cannot control the billing process. Okay, you cannot determine that the tutor has to bill a certain way, but you can use software to offer the tutor a convenient way of carrying out split billing, where it's convenient for the tutor to get paid, it's convenient for you to get paid. Now, there's one other aspect for employment agencies which we should cover. Okay, it is allowed under the employment agency model for the tutor to collect the whole fee and to pay you as the agency. That's fine. But what the tutor is doing is they must provide both invoices to the client, right? The client's still going to be able to know, if they want to, how much the agency is going to get. And this would be in the client's contract anyway, right? So the client would know this. There's no way around that. There's no way for the client not to be told. Yeah, because the client's going to need to pay the tutor at least in some fashion, and even if they go through split billing, they'll get an email with 2 invoices attached. Yeah, even if it says pay one total amount. Yeah, but it is allowed for the tutor to collect the whole fee and pass the agency's fee onto the agency. That is permissible under the regulations. It's relatively unusual, but it is allowed. Okay, so where are we with employment agency, employment business? So a quick recap on what they are. So an employment business is an intermediary that is contracted by clients to deliver a good or service, in this case, tuition. It then goes and either employs people as employees or contracts contractors, so self-employed tutors in this case, to go and deliver that service on its own behalf. Okay, we'll talk a bit more about self-employment and employment in a minute, but an employment business, okay, provides the service to the client and finds someone to go and deliver that on its behalf. An employment agency provides an introduction to the client, and then the tutor works for the client directly, but that the employment agency has in its agreement with the client the right to charge a fee, which normally for tuition companies is a fixed amount per hour of tuition delivered. Okay. Employment agencies have a reduced VAT liability because there's not going to be any VAT on the tutor's portion of the fees in almost all cases. And they have a reduced VAT liability, but they also can't avoid the parents or the consumers from seeing what their fee is going to be, what cut they take. They can't prevent the consumers from seeing that. And they also have to abide by this the conduct regulations, whereby you must use a form of split billing in order to take the fee efficiently if you want to do that. You are allowed, if you wanted to, for the tutor to bill and for you to bill totally separately. That's completely allowed. It's just not very convenient. Okay. So there's the recap of employment agency and employment business. Right. We'll move. Has anyone got any questions on that so far? Because that's normally a bit where people have a sticking point.
Just a quick question, John, if I may, about the employment intermediary reporting. If you're operating as an employment agency where you're introducing parents, clients to a tutor using the split payments model, and they're tutoring at the client's home, do you need to do intermediary reporting for that?
If that's all you're doing and you are not paying any contractors separately yourself, then no, because you never pay those tutors. That's right. Yeah. The legislation says you're not allowed to even arrange for payment to those tutors. Yeah. Okay. So you can't control that payment at all to the tutor. So you're never paying them. And employment intermediary reporting only counts when you're the intermediary and you receive the money and then you pay it on.
Right. I see.
Now, if you're doing that as an employment agency, you're majorly breaking the law. So, so we have bigger problems. Yeah. Yeah. But as an employment agency, you'd never be doing that. So there's no reporting to do. Obviously, some companies do operate as a hybrid, and they do some work under the employment business model, and they have contracts and a system and process in place for that. And they do some work under the employment agency model, and they have contracts and systems and processes which are different, which are appropriate for that. And never the two should meet, right? They should be treated as completely separately and run as almost separate operations. Excuse me. If that is the case, then you may still have to do employment intermediary reporting. But again, it will only account to the employment business side of what you're doing, because as an employment agency, you're never paying the tutors. And it's not your job to send employment intermediary reports because the client has paid the tutor. From HMRC's perspective, that's nothing to do with you. I mean, even if you're getting a fee, that payment is not made by you. So they don't need you to declare that that's going on.
Okay.
That's outside of the scope of employment intermediary reporting. So short answer, if you're exclusively acting as an employment agency and you don't have any off-payroll contractors at all, there's never a requirement to do employment intermediary reporting. Yeah. The one area where there's a caveat here is if you do something like all your tutors are going through the employment agency model, but you've got a contractor who you pay off payroll to do admin for you or something, because obviously then that person, if they're working from your address or your office, you would potentially be liable to do off payroll employment intermediary reporting for them, but obviously it wouldn't apply to your tutors. So just the caveat there is that the actual tuition is outside of scope, but if you then have an off payroll contractor somewhere else in your business, or anyone doing something like that that's then paid not going through PAYE, then you potentially have a liability to do it.
Okay. So I suppose if you take on admin staff and things like that, you might just need to carefully look at how you're paying them.
If they're employees, it's not a problem because obviously they're paid through PAYE. When people first take on an employee, it feels very scary, right? I've done this before. Lots of people have done this before. First of all, you're like, oh, they've got all the employment rights. There's so many things you need to think about. There's so many obligations involved. Employment contracts get fairly complicated. There's lots to think about when you first start doing it. But once you've started doing it and you're paying PAYE with, I don't know, Xero or QuickBooks or some other Sage accounting software every month, and you're running payroll at the click of a button, well, it's not really that scary after that, because you quickly get to grips with what's the main rights and obligations you have as an employer. As long as you're following those, generally speaking, I wouldn't say the rest is plain sailing. You still have HR issues to deal with, but the rest of it is legally quite straightforward, right? As an employer, and this is one of the next things we're going to come to, it's not that scary once you get to grips with what the actual reality of what you have to do is day to day. Yeah, people often have this feeling before they become an employer that it's going to be some huge hurdle and it's going to be almost impossible to jump, but that's not generally the case.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, Andy?
That's excellent, thank you.
No problem. So let's take the opportunity now to move on to the employment, self-employment perspective. There is a misconception that being an employment business means you must employ your tutors as employees. It's not true. And it's actually also another misconception, even more widely held, which if you're an employment agency, the tutors are never employed. That's also not true, although they can't be employed by you. So let's break it down and have a look at how this works under both models. And let's take the employment business model first. Now, let's give ourselves a quick reminder of what this is for those people who are watching and perhaps not familiar with it. The employment business model is where you're the intermediary, you have a contract with the parent, and you have a contract with the tutors to provide it. Now, what kind of contract do you have with the tutor? Do you have a self-employment contract for services with the tutor, or do you have a contract of service, basically an employment contract? Okay. Now, most tuition companies have 0 hours in tuition, 0 hours employment contracts if they have employment contracts at all. Not all. There are 1 or 2 exceptions where people have taken on tutors full-time or part-time, but most companies don't do that. Most companies, if they want to employ tutors, they'll take them on a 0 hours basis, and they'll offer them work like any other 0 hours contract, working for a bar, working for anyone else, and they'll offer them work. And if the tutor takes the work, then they get paid for it as an employee, right? So as we just discussed, the employment business option, you can either employ your tutors or you can have them as contractors, contract for services. So what's the difference? Now, as I said, people, when they first start employing people, they get very worried about it. There's employment rights, there's PAYE, there's lots of other implications, and people feel like it's a big hurdle to jump. It's manageable. It's a learning curve, but it's not one that it's one that hundreds of people have done before and managed to get right. Okay, if you put in a bit of effort, it's not a problem. Things you should be aware of if you go down the employment route. Okay, if you go down the employment route, you can tell your tutors exactly how and when and what you want them to teach, and how to teach it. You can direct them as much as you like. Yeah, you can force them to turn up to training, although if you force them to turn up to training, you would have to pay them at least the minimum wage. Yeah, you can force them to teach standing on their head if you really want to. Right? You can force them to use certain systems and resources or tools. That's absolutely fine. As an employer, you've got complete control over, obviously within the law, you've got complete control over how that tutor should deliver that service on your behalf. They are part of your company. If you're an employer, you need insurance for employer's liability, because if the tutor does anything bad, it's your company that is on the line, and that's what employer's liability is for. It's not scary. Employer's liability is very, very common insurance. Any business insurance package will offer that, and they'll offer it to some huge limit that you probably think you're never going to need, but just there are legal limits that you must meet. So just get yourself employer's liability insurance and you'll be covered. So if you're an employer, you can direct people as much as you like, and that's one of the main advantages. Now, there are implications in terms of holiday pay, because obviously 0 hours employees are still entitled to holiday pay. Okay, and there's a multiplier to work it out for the statutory minimum of holiday pay, which is times their amount they earn by 0.1227, and that's the amount of paid extra time they should get in holiday. So if someone earns £10,000 in the year, then they're entitled to 11,227 pounds of pay in that year, but there'll be an element of that which is for unpaid leave, so for paid leave, so holiday basically. Now, for 0 hours, it works a bit more. It's a bit more complicated because there's all these questions about whether you can pay rolled up holiday pay. So pay them holiday pay at the same time as paying their salary and just not worry about it. Now, with 0 hours contractors, this is a difficult area of law, and there is recent case law which we're going over as DTA to review what the situation is. But what we would say is you need to make sure that you set a level of pay for them which accounts for holiday pay being added on top. So don't pay them £40 an hour now and then get surprised when you need to pay them the holiday pay on top. You should pay them £40 less than the holiday pay and set that as your rate, which is 30 divided by 1.1227. 40 divided by 1.1227, right? That gives you the amount, the original amount, if you'd added that holiday pay on top of an original amount, right? And then that amount will be their pay, and that's what you pay them. And then obviously when it comes to holiday, they want to take some holiday, you pay them for the holiday, and it will be up to the maximum amount that's left over. Okay. So you need to obviously think about this in advance. You can't go and employ them for 6 months and then go, oh no, damn it, I've got to pay loads of holiday. They want to take a 6-month holiday and I've got to pay them all their holiday pay up to the limit that they've got, right? You should think about this in advance so that you are planning ahead and you'll factor this in when you're actually taking tutors on board. Obviously tell them they will be entitled to holiday pay if they're 0 hours employees. Now, 0 hours employees are still relatively uncommon in the tuition sector. I suspect that it might get slightly more common in the future because there are advantages to doing this in terms of control, and in terms of then you can have more stipulations around the service you provide. But even still, it's relatively uncommon. Most tutors in the UK, more than 85%, are self-employed contractors. Okay, and that means they are on a contract for services. They're basically providing the tuition services as though they were another business. Well, they are another business, a sole trader, normally. Okay. If tutors are delivering their services as a self-employed contractor, then you will not pay PAYE for them. You'll pay them gross. But then if the tutor is working from a location that's managed by the client, you're likely to be liable for employment intermediary reporting. So you just need to bear that in mind, because you're not paying them through payroll. You're not paying PAYE and deducting tax at source. Okay. Does that make sense to people so far? No questions, nothing in the chat. One thumbs up.
Yes, John. Good. Yes.
Perfect. So that's how it works in terms of contract for services. Now, the contract for services can still have the stipulations that you want them to follow. You can still stipulate that they have made declarations that they have got appropriate qualifications. You can still stipulate that they must act in a professional way with the tutees. There can be stipulations in the contract for services, which again, you need to plan in advance. You need to know what is it you're taking this tutor on as a contractor to do on your behalf. But what you can't do is then mess around with how they deliver it on the ground day by day. What you can't really do is then exercise supervision, direction, or control over the tutor. Yeah, and it's probably not advisable for you to do that anyway. If they're a self-employed tutor, the chances are they probably know what they're doing. And if they don't know what they're doing, don't work with them. Okay, but if they do know what they're doing, and then you don't need to supervise, direct, or control them. Okay, now there is a tool to determine on HMRC's website whether tutors will be deemed to be employees or self-employed workers for tax purposes. I should strongly suggest you go and you use this tool. It's called CEST. So if you type in HMRC CEST into Google, you'll get this come up, right? It stands for Checking Employment Status for Tax. And you basically answer a series of questions. And if you answer those questions honestly, HMRC stands by the determination it gives at the end of that tool. So you answer a couple of questions like, does the tutor take on their own financial risk? Well, yeah, if they take out a big loan to buy loads of tuition gear and stuff, and then they don't do very much tuition work and they can't pay it back, that's their risk. Because normally it's not very common for tutors to have to spend a lot of money on equipment or resources, but if they went off and bought every single textbook for maths GCSE, for example, and then realized they couldn't pay the the loan back, that would be their risk and they would be taking that, and that would not be affecting you at all. You wouldn't be reimbursing them for this. So then you could say, yes, that's the tutors take on their own financial risk. Then you go through the other questions. And one of the questions is about supervision, direction, and control. Okay, and there'll be other questions that affect different other areas, which have a bearing on whether someone's an employee, a deemed employee for tax purposes, or whether they're a genuinely self-employed worker. So, for example, self-employed workers, you can't have any kind of exclusivity arrangement with them. Yeah, they can work for whoever they want. That's up to them. They're almost like they're a business. Yeah, you can't turn up to a supplier. You can't turn up to Xero, the accounting software, and say, "Oh, you can only provide accounting software to me. You can't provide accounting software to anyone else." You can't do that, right? Nor would they say yes, of course. But you can't have exclusivity arrangements with self-employed tutors. And there's a couple of other questions you need to answer as well. If you go through that and it gets to the end and it says that it thinks they are self-employed for tax purposes, as long as you've answered those questions correctly, HMRC will back you, will stand by that. So then you know you're in the clear. If it says they're an employee for tax purposes, then you need to make sure you put them on employment contracts, proper employment contracts, or change the structure and the systems of your business if it's not something you wanted to do, right? But you must make sure you follow that, because if you are later found to be deemed to be employing them, if HMRC comes around later and says, well, look, irrespective of what you said, we think actually you're treating them as employees, then they can potentially come after you for the tax that they should have paid. And if that tutor's ever underpaid tax, then you're liable, because they'll say, well, no, you should have deducted tax at source via PAYE. So we don't want you to be in a situation where you ever have this deemed employment being imposed upon you, where you've kind of treated the tutors as employees and HMRC comes after you because it holds you liable for their tax. Okay, so you must make sure that you use the HMRC CEST tool. Now, there is a spanner in the works, and that is that sometimes the tool comes up at the end and it says it doesn't know. It can't tell you whether they're an employee or a contractor for tax purposes. That's a difficult thing. And the best thing I would say there is you're okay because you're members of TTA. You can come to us and TTA can give you some advice and guidance in terms of what the situation might be in that particular case. And that's something that TTA helps people with, right? I always say, when people ask what is TTA's benefit for me or whatever, I always say, look, we'll be there when you need us most. I don't know what it's going to be, but at some point you'll need us, and that's where we'll come in. So use the HMRC CEST tool. That's the main thing. If it does come up with can't make a determination, we'll do our best to help you. So that's employment status for tax as an employment business. Now, there is someone that says, I've had this situation as the tool says it can't tell. Who should I email TTA for help? The answer is obviously yes. Thank you very much for asking the question. If you do have the situation where it's the tool that said it can't help you and it can't tell you, then do come to TTA. Email info@thetutorsassociation.org.uk. We will be able to get back to you and process that and provide you with some guidance on what we think you should probably do. Or we can go to HMRC on your behalf without mentioning you and say, look, we've got this kind of situation. Is this what would you say this situation is? And we have spoken to HMRC's employment status for tax experts who have agreed that they will provide us determinations for cases that are common within the tuition sector, but where we haven't been able to establish a clear answer. Yeah, so we can go to HMRC on your behalf to do that. They won't do it for you as a random company. They don't provide these kinds of determinations to people unless they think you've underpaid tax, in which case they do, and then they say you've got to pay all this extra tax, which is not where you want to be, right? So we can, for common models that are unclear, we as TTA can go to HMRC and try and establish a determination for you and come back and give you the guidelines around what HMRC say. Yeah. And that way you can then just deal with us. We'll deal with HMRC on your behalf, but you won't be able to go to HMRC to get these determinations in advance, I'm afraid. That's fine. That's what we're here for. So now we move on to employment status for employment agencies. And this is a little bit different because most employment agencies, remember the employment agency model is when you're introducing a tutor. You aren't legally liable as the company to provide any tuition. You're only liable to provide the introduction, and you are paid normally a fixed fee per hour of tuition delivered. or a fixed fee per course that's delivered if they're selling fixed price courses. Yeah. And you're then introducing those tutors. The tutors go off and deliver that tuition. And then there's a split billing mechanism, because remember, it's illegal for you to arrange for payment to the tutor directly. So you can't take the payment from the client. Now, it's still possible for the tutor to be employed by the client. So, for example, a case when this does sometimes happen is when the client is overseas and pays for the tutor to fly out to them and teach their kid for 6 months, right? Well, that's totally fine. But the client might then employ that tutor. Or it could be a residential placement in the UK. It doesn't have to be overseas. Yeah. If that's the case, then obviously the tutor is being employed, but they're not being employed by you. Okay. But your contracts that you have between you as a tuition company and between the client should account for what happens in this particular case, because they will have employment rights and you don't want to be liable for them. You don't want the tutor to be coming to you and saying, well, I want my holiday paid from you guys. Yeah. You don't want there to be a dispute in this. Typically speaking, under the employment agency model and operation, there is a limited legal relationship between the tutor and between the company itself, the employment agency. Basically, the limits of your obligations are: we will represent you to introduce you to clients, but we don't promise to find you any. We'll just do our best. Okay, and the tutor has obligations to represent themselves fairly. I mean, this is all fairly standard stuff. So under the employment agency model, it is possible for the tutor to be an employee, but they would be an employee directly of the client. Okay, and in that case, probably the most normal thing for the contracts to do would be to allow for some sort of buyout for the tutor. So the tutor can basically be bought from the employment agency. The introduction can be bought outright. So probably would in that case be a number of few £1,000s or something. And that might be a model that works for you, and that's the model that some tuition companies use. Now, on this point, when we talk about contracts, it's worth us having a brief pause to say, where are you going to get all these contracts from? Some of you will be aware that TTA went through a joint procurement effort at the end of last year to pay very expensive lawyers a lot of money to buy all of the contracts you need for both employment business and employment agency models. It's our compliance pack, and we've basically split the cost of the compliance pack between the number of members we think are going to buy it, right? And so it works out that it's about £995. It is £995 to purchase that whole pack, but the whole pack is worth about £60,000. Okay, so if you want to get hold of a compliance pack, it is an extra cost. It is discounted heavily for members. It's £1,950 if you're not a member, but for members, we discounted it heavily, and it's very, very valuable. I mean, you won't be able to buy one of these contracts for £1,000, let alone there's about 12 or 14 documents, 12 documents, I think, that's included. It includes everything you need for the employment business, employment agency, and it also includes additional support if you need it. Plus, if you ever get inspected by EAS or by anybody else, then we will stand by those contracts and advocate for you on your behalf at no extra cost, provided that you've actually followed the contract and you've not butchered it and changed it in important places. So that's the piece on the compliance packs. So if anyone's worried about all the contractual elements of this and how to include all this into a contract, there is an easy way for us to be able to facilitate you doing that if that's something you have an issue with. And we provide the free support around that as well. So what have we covered so far? Brief recap of where we are at the moment. So first of all, we've done HMRC and the basics of tax. So you have to pay corporation tax on profits. You have to pay PAYE for any employed staff you have, whether they're tutors or admin staff. And you have to collect that PAYE, that tax at source, and pay it to HMRC. You also have to pay VAT if you're above the £85,000 threshold. And we've got employment intermediary reporting, which I did promise I'll come to. We've then covered the basics of employment agency versus employment business. So an employment agency introduces a tutor and then takes normally a certain fee per hour of tuition delivered, all stipulated in the contract, and that is due by the client. And then you've got the employment business model, which is a normal kind of model for most businesses, where the business itself delivers the tuition, but it contracts with or employs a tutor to deliver it on its behalf. Okay, so we've done employment agency versus employment business. Employment business pays more VAT. but has a little bit more control over what tuition is delivered, or quite a lot more control if it employs the tutors. Employment agency minimizes liability for VAT, but it also means you can't control the payment to, or arrange for the payment to the tutor. The tutor has to be able to take their payment themselves and be in control of that process. And you can use split billing tools to do that. Okay, so we've done the employment agency versus employment business. We've also done employment status for tax, and we've talked about how both employment businesses and employment agencies can end up in situations where they're dealing with employed tutors. Either the tutor is employed directly by the employment business, or under the employment agency model, the tutor could be employed by the client directly. Okay, so I did promise to come on to employment intermediary reporting. So this is something which you can do from HMRC's website. You can type in HMRC employment intermediary reporting. It will all come up. You need to report quarterly if you pay workers off payroll, so like tutors that are self-employed, excuse me, if you pay workers off payroll, and if they work at or from premises controlled by the client. Yeah. So if they go to a school to deliver a school program, obviously it's going to be controlled by a client. If they go to the parent's house and they do all the tuition from the parent's house, it's going to be controlled by the client. If they're doing all their tuition online, or the vast majority of it's online, or they're going and taking the client to a public place, then it's not controlled by the client. So those particular workers are unlikely to fall within the scope of employment intermediary reporting. Now, employment intermediary reporting requires you to have certain bits of information in order to be able to submit a report. So you need a PAYE reference, okay? Some tuition companies don't have a PAYE reference because they simply don't employ anybody at all. Okay, and if that's the case, we've spoken to HMRC about this. They can provide you with a pseudo PAYE reference, basically a fake one, but a fake one provided by HMRC. So it will actually pass through, and they will know that that PAYE reference doesn't actually refer to any employees, but that it allows you to submit the form. So if you do have that situation, contact TTA. We can help you with getting that from HMRC. Some people have had other issues, and as I said earlier, and I'll say this again, if you do have issues with employment intermediary reporting and we can't solve them for you, we've said to HMRC, look, there are some outstanding issues. For those companies, we are advising those companies to do whatever they were doing beforehand. If you were reporting beforehand, do it how you were doing it. If you weren't, then keep not reporting. Do whatever you were doing beforehand until we can establish an authoritative answer from HMRC. So if there is an issue with doing employment intermediary reporting, then you come to us and you tell us that. Now, the other issues that people have had is where the tutors they're working with don't have a unique tax reference number. So, for example, tutors don't actually have to register for self-assessment until they're earning more than £1,000 a year. There are some tutors who just don't, they just do it part-time, and they don't do it for a lot of money, and they just don't earn more than £1,000 a year. So they don't have a unique tax reference number. In that case, we're still waiting from HMRC as to how we can deal with that. So if that's the problem you have, then I'm afraid the recommendation we can give you for the time being is do whatever you're doing beforehand while we try and fix that with HMRC. Okay. So that's an overview of employment intermediary reporting in a nutshell. If you do have other issues, of course, come back to us. We do help many members deal with this kind of stuff. And that is something that we obviously offer as TTA. Okay. Now, there's a last section that I just want to briefly cover, which is employment agencies and employment businesses with regard to the different those different models and delivering tuition to schools and local authorities. Okay. Now, delivering schools to local authorities, so delivering tuition to schools and local authorities, normally those businesses choose to go down the employment business route. And they do that because schools and local authorities can claim back the VAT, so they don't care, they have to pay it. Yeah, so there's no need to go for it. And they normally don't want a split billing with instruction to lots of different tutors. A school or a local authorities are very likely to want you as the company to be responsible for delivering it all. And they don't want to know about 50 different tutors. Yeah, they don't care about the VAT because they're going to be able to claim it back. So there's no benefit from the VAT angle. So if you are envisaging going down the route of creating, doing a lot of work to schools and local authorities, then you are probably going to want to be an employment business because the VAT effect, there will be no disadvantage in terms of VAT because they'll claim it back, and they probably won't want to be introduced to lots of different tutors. And that leads us on to another point, which is about VAT. So TTA did another joint procurement activity on VAT to get some guidance on a load of different things, including disaggregation, where you own more than one company, right? And about the situations where HMRC can basically force you to combine those companies if it thinks it's to evade VAT. Yeah, because remember that VAT has that £85,000 limit, that threshold. If you go above that £85,000 threshold, you have to register for VAT. Well, HMRC can turn around and say, well, look, you've got two companies both earning £84,000, but we think you're only doing that for tax to get away with not having to pay VAT. So we're going to force you to put them together. I'll come on to this in just a second again. There are other issues as well, including what the VAT status is for online tuition and place of supply rules. So some people arguing about whether place of supply is in the UK, if they're doing online tuition to another country, or whether it's abroad. Depending on the circumstances of the case, it can be either, but we've got that guidance, which again, we jointly procured for membership. If you do have issues like this and you want to buy that guidance, it's £400 plus VAT. But this is not because I want you to all go off and buy it. It's only if you actually need specialist VAT help. If your VAT situation is fairly basic, then you won't need it. You just need to know that if you go above the £85,000 threshold, then you will have to register for VAT. If you do register for VAT, obviously your liability for VAT is going to be determined by being an employment business or an employment agency, and therefore how much of that revenue actually comes to your business, and that's the sales which you then apply VAT onto. Okay, just quickly on VAT while we're there. We've talked already about companies being liable for VAT. There's a few ways in which you could completely legally structure your operations as a tuition company and not have to pay VAT. The first one is being a sole trader. Any tuition you deliver as a sole trader is VAT exempt. That means it doesn't even count towards a threshold. But it means you must deliver it as a sole trader, and it must be billed from the sole trader. So if you run a tuition company and also deliver some tuition yourself, you can't have a contract with yourself and the tuition company and then bill it out, because that would be VATable. The tuition that you do personally should still be done personally and should not go through the company, because then it's VAT exempt. Yeah. So tuition delivered by a sole trader is VAT exempt. There's no VAT levied, and it doesn't count towards the threshold, right? But it doesn't count as soon as that goes through a limited company. As soon as the limited company is now billing for that tuition, VAT applies. Okay. So if you are doing tuition yourself as well as running a company, then you should do the tuition yourself as a sole trader, because then it is VAT exempt. There's one other case where you don't have to pay VAT, which is where you are an eligible body. And an eligible body, generally for the purposes of VAT, you can go and we can send you more details on this if you've got an interest in going down this route. An eligible body is generally a non-profit that delivers tuition services on a non-profit basis. And the non-profit company can't distribute profits at all, which obviously is the point of a non-profit, which means it can't pay dividends, but it can still employ you on a salary at a sensible market rate. But a sensible market rate could be quite a broad range, depending on some charity executives get paid quite a lot of money to run a charity. It's not that that's necessarily a restriction, but it must be. You can't say, oh, 1 year I'm going to pay myself £1 million just because I feel like it. That obviously would look like distribution of profits. But anyway, you could employ yourself as an employee and have a non-profit company, and then it would potentially count as an eligible body and be exempt from VAT for the tuition it provides and for the educational services it provides. So some people have considered going down that route and becoming creating a non-profit company and paying themselves a salary, because they don't envisage turning it into a multi-million-pound company that's going to earn megabucks and that they're going to distribute millions in shares in dividends. Their purpose is to provide. They're good at tuition. They want to provide tuition to more people. There's no problem with doing that as a non-profit company and then just paying everyone a salary. That's absolutely fine, and that's something that some people considered and want to do. And the last area in which you could potentially structure your business in which you would not have to pay VAT, or you would limit your VAT liability, is as a partnership. because the same exemption that applies for sole traders also applies to partnerships. Now, we don't know, and no one can seem to tell us whether it applies to limited liability partnerships, LLPs, but to a straightforward partnership, it does apply. And that basically is like two people operating together as a single entity, but very similarly to the way a sole trader would operate. So they have liability for what that partnership does, and there's a partnership agreement which divides up who gets what share of what monies and what responsibilities and obligations there are. Now, if you're interested in looking at that, that's a potentially interesting way to go, because if there's a small club of you that all do tuition together, and one person sort of runs the show and the rest of them are all sort of friends and work in the same area, for example, a partnership might be a good way to go. You can have more than two people. Yeah, you can have 9 partners, tutor partners, for example, and they could all get paid in accordance with the tuition they do, according to the partnership agreement, and that would also be VAT exempt. Okay, so if there's a club of you and there's only a limited number, so it's manageable, then that might be a way that you want to go. You don't need to set up a limited company to do that, because the limited company would incur VAT. But you might say, look, we all form a partnership. We're going to have senior tutor partners and junior tutor partners. If there's maybe quite a few of you and you want to sort of separate the different levels, and people have their own rights and responsibilities within that partnership agreement. And that structure would also be exempt from VAT. So it doesn't matter how much you earn from doing tuition through that partnership, that revenue would all be that would be VAT exempt, would never count towards your threshold, your VAT threshold. Okay, be careful. Obviously, if you do other work and that gets more than £85,000, that might you might then have to register for VAT for that. Question: my accountant said they think an EFL limited company would also be exempt. Yes, there is an exemption for companies for teaching English as a foreign language, but it's only the tuition of English as a foreign language which is VAT exempt. If you are then also doing other tuition, that does not count as being VAT exempt. So if you've got a limited company and you're doing EFL tuition, that is VAT exempt under the certain stipulations, but that is VAT exempt. However, if you then do maths tuition as well as a limited company, remember that would incur VAT if you reach the threshold. It would be counted as VATable income. So yes, absolutely great question. If you are teaching EFL, English as a foreign language, to people that don't speak English and want to learn English, then that is also VAT exempt. Okay. Any other questions on compliance? We've rattled through quite a lot. I appreciate there's quite a lot there to go through, and I do appreciate to some people this can come across as a bit dry at times. Done my best to try and make it clear and dispel lots and lots of pages of legislation and regulation into 1 hour. I appreciate there's challenges in doing that. But has anyone got any questions about it so far that's on the call? I hope that's because it's really clear. And will we be sent the recording? The recording will go out to all TTA members. Yep, so you will be able to see this recording. And there's another question, which is, what are the rules about charging tutor fees when operating as an agency? You can sell things to tutors as an agency, but you can't charge them a fee. You can't charge them to find them work. That's absolutely prohibited. And you can't charge them things. We would very, very, very strongly recommend you don't try and charge things like late invoice fees. Okay. So if they submit a report to you to say, oh, here's the kids that I've taught, and they do it after the date you've asked them to do it, we would very, very strongly recommend you do not try and charge them any kind of fee for that. Now, obviously, they'll send you, if they're doing that for you, then if they do it late, you might, it's frustrating. I appreciate that, but there's not much you can do about it in terms of you can't charge them a fee. Yeah. Is there a one-off fee to produce a profile on your website with a photo to assist finding work? No, you would not be able to do that. That would not be allowed. You need to basically to do that on your own. That's your job as an agency, basically, to take that risk and spend that effort to set them up. If you're an agency, you cannot charge the work seeker fees for finding them work. That is strictly prohibited. Please do not do that. Okay. You can obviously charge clients registration fees if you want to, if the client's willing to pay, I suppose. That's up to you. There's far less restriction on what you can charge the clients. And you could sell services to the tutors as long as the tutors genuinely are not compelled or pressured into buying it. So if you offer a training package and it's chargeable, or if you sell resources, like let's say you produce some sort of book or something, and your resource pack, and you wanted to sell it to the tutors, then you're allowed to do that, but the tutors must be free to say, no, actually, I don't want that. And you don't penalize them in any way. So you basically need to treat tutors that do buy it and don't buy it exactly the same when it comes to work finding services. You can't say, oh, well, you guys bought my resource pack, so I'm going to find you work first. That would definitely not be allowed. Yeah. Nor can you say, oh, well, you didn't buy a resource pack, so I'm going to try and stop the tuition and replace you with this particular client. That would also not be allowed. Yeah. Does that make it clear? Hope so. And a final one to check. Formal reference checks. You need to carry these out on your own cost as an employment agency. If you'll need reference checks, you obviously will need DBS checks because that's a mandatory condition of TTA membership. So if you're a TTA member, then you have to make sure that all of your tutors have a DBS check that is at least within the last year or on the update service. You have to have DBS checks, and obviously the tutor has to pay for their DBS check. If they're self-employed, they have to pay for their DBS check. You could offer that they get it through you. TTA has a service where you can get the reference check, the DBS checks through your TTA. And TTA can help with some of these things. That's totally fine. But you can't charge the tutor unless you're selling them a service. So if you're selling them the DBS check and they want to buy it from you and not from someone else, that's fine. Obviously, you then pay the provider, the umbrella provider who provided the DBS check for you with the central DBS agency. So you can't, I mean, the simplest thing is you can sell services as long as they're completely free to go and buy it from somewhere else if they wish to. That's pretty much it. Okay. So if there's no other questions, then we'll wrap up here. Just a quick reminder, if you do have questions about compliance stuff, we're very, very happy to try and help you. TTA has a good relationship with many of the government agencies that are engaged in all this kind of regulation. At our national conference every year, they're almost always represented. And so you can speak to them yourself and you can talk to them in yourself. If you need us to help you with some certain issue, then obviously that's what TTA membership is for. We're happy to do that. And that's something that many people have done with us in the past. And we've been able to help people in some cases save them a lot of money. Can you just get safeguarding training and updates via TTA, even if they're non-members? So if they're non-members, we would very, very strongly recommend you tell any non-members to sign up to our free mailing list. The free mailing list means that they will get access to, they'll get updates on what we're offering to people, what is available out there that we can provide them on a regular basis. They're not going to get spammed with emails. They'll get emails a couple of times a year, maybe once a month. We'll just keep them updated with what's going on in the sector. Obviously, they don't have to be a member to be able to do that. Some of the training that we do offer is only free for members. It's not free for non-members as well. And some of the events are subsidized for members. So obviously being members is handy. But if they don't want to, for some reason, it's not a problem. They might realize it's worth it in the end, but they can just stay on the mailing list as a non-member. So we very strongly recommend, for those of you on the call and for those of you who maybe watch it later, definitely recommend to your tutors, go to TTA's website and just sign up to the free mailing list and get updates on what's going on in the sector. And that will help them to stay abreast of what regulatory changes there are, how they should be treated, what the situation is like, what the normal process is like, and then they'll be able to come to us if they want to ask us anything. Okay, so we'll wrap up here then. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you for the great questions. I know it's a bit of a dense and heavy topic to go through, but hopefully you found it useful. For those of you who are watching this after the event, remember, if you do need the contracts, we do offer the compliance pack and it is heavily discounted for members. We are here to try and help you, so we want to make sure you can get it right. If you've got questions, please come to us, info@thetutorsassociation.org.uk. and we'll hopefully make sure that you're all well looked after. Thanks so much.